maybe I develop something that's an analysis and then I want to then automate it. And so then I'm going the reverse way. And I'm like, oh my God, what was I doing here? Like this needs to be done better. And so it's interesting, even when it's yourself going back and forth, because just by having a different mindset, you see it entirely different, the problem and the solution too.
This episode of Ken's Nearest Neighbors is powered by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. Today I had the pleasure of interviewing Stefanie Molin. Stefanie is a software engineer and data scientist on Bloomberg's security data science team, which researches and develops solutions using data and machine learning to help improve and automate Bloomberg's information security process. She focuses on identifying and answering security-related questions using data and developing software to address them. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Operations Research from Columbia University and is currently pursuing a master's degree in computer science with a specialization in machine learning from Georgia Tech. She's also the author of Hands-On Data Analysis with Pandas, now in its second edition. I did also happen to write the foreword for her book. In this episode, you learn from Stefanie about how she breaks down a colossal project like writing a book like this. You also get to understand her position at the intersection of data science and software engineering and what she's learned from both domains. I hope you enjoy the episode. Stefanie, thank you so much for coming on the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast today. Obviously, we have a little bit of history together. You know, we've talked quite a bit, and I've written the foreword for the second edition of your book that just came out. I'm very excited about this, and I'm very excited to have you on to talk about, one, your experience working in the data domain, two, the experience of just tackling a huge project like a book, and then also having everyone who's listening just learn a little bit more about you, your philosophy, how you think, and how you work.
Thanks for having me, Ken. I'm very excited to be on the KNN podcast.
Excellent. Well, as you may know, I like to get things started off with a little bit of an origin story. And I'd love to hear about the first time you realized that you were interested in the data domain.
Okay, so we're gonna have to go, back to first job out of college. So when I graduated, I didn't really have any idea of what I wanted to do. So for background, I did a degree at Columbia Engineering in operations research. So I had kind of the statistics, computer science, econ background. So it lended itself to a lot of things, but for someone who didn't know what they wanted to do, it kind of still left me a little bit confused. So I had a little bit of an interest in marketing at the time. Not so much making the ad campaigns, but more of like the auction stuff behind it. And so I went into a job that was around yield management, I guess you could describe, and it was about setting up these campaigns, running them, optimizing them, and then also some reporting aspect. And so I guess that was probably the first bit of the data. But what really got me into data itself was at one point we began to get or ingest logs from the platforms that we were actually using to run these campaigns and to set them up. And this was like stuff that was like where the placement was on the web, how much you bid for it, what were the other bids and what were, like, where was it being shown, what zip codes, stuff like that. And so there was so much data there. And one of the coworkers had started one of the newer ones had started teaching everyone a little bit of R and a little bit of SQL. Now, SQL was something that I just did not do well with in college. I mean, it sounds super straightforward, and it's like, how can someone work in data without having gotten that? But there's hope. So it was, for me, and this is also ties back into the book, but for me, I realized that the big problem of not understanding the SQL in college was because the examples just didn't resonate as like real examples to me. So then being in the workforce and having this data, it was like, I knew exactly what the things were. It was like a refresher. I was like, oh, I know what this statement needs to be. I know what the query needs to be. But it was just that having a good example and tying things together. And so I started doing a lot of R SQL stuff. And anytime we wrapped up a campaign, I would try to do some insights so that we could share them with the client. Things like, what areas, what regions was the campaign getting interacted a lot with? I was specifically did a lot of that, like regional, like where was zip codes are popular and stuff. That was probably the main thing I focused on. But I got very interested in doing that. And I was like, how can I do more of this? And so I ended up kind of honing those skills a little bit in side projects and then transitioning into a job at another company in the space, but doing just data analysis work. And then through doing that, I guess I kind of almost had the opposite experience where it's like, oh, maybe I don't like data so much. Maybe I like the coding aspect of the data stuff. And so through my time there, I ended up on a hackathon team and we developed an alerting system. And this was something where we had teams, or we had participants from various teams. So people who focused on design, people who could handle like setting up a server and automating things. And then, myself who was handling the data and the SQL queries and writing a script that could gather what we needed to do and do the analysis to determine, are there any campaigns that someone should be focusing on as an account manager? Is there anything that someone should maybe like, hey, this should be brought to their attention, and then maybe they can intervene? So having like an extra layer of defense that gives someone their what to do in the morning when they come in, kind of thing. And then through that process, it's really like, wow, I like this coding thing, and I like that there's coding and data. And then kind of transitioned a little bit more into that intersection of the two, or doing both, starting to do a little bit of dev stuff, and then also always having data involved. So having data products, stuff that uses data, stuff that collects data, creates data, etc. And eventually that landed me to where I am now. So
I really like that story because there's clear decision points that you have, and it seems like you've assessed what you like about the field and you've taken action on that. Another thing that I think is really interesting, especially when you're talking about your adoption or your interest in SQL, is it was really highly correlated with what you were using it for. And I ran into that exact same thing in school my entire life. In college, in high school and in most of college, I was a terrible student. And it wasn't till I took an economics course where I started using data and understanding it, and eventually doing a project where I applied it to my golf game, that I saw the power in all of this, and I was immediately hooked. I went from essentially a C student to a straight A student over the course of a single semester. And there is so much power in, again, applying this knowledge to a problem that is relevant to you, where that individual importance can shine and come out. And that's one reason that I'm constantly stressing people work on personal projects, because if you can see how whatever tech stack you're using is applicable to the specific problem you're working on, you're going to be so much more inclined to work on it and put energy into it and build something that's impressive or useful to you.
Yeah, totally agree, 100%. And that's also like big philosophy behind the book, which we'll get to a bit. But it was just like, there's even in that previous job where I ended up building an R course and teaching people. And one of the things I noticed, and one of the things that I was like, I have to include in here when I built this course, was that people can do these courses that teach them maybe how to do, like, for example, they were using DataCamp. And so they're learning how to use R in that case. And then they come and do their analysis task the same way they weren't changing it, because there's like a disconnect in how you bridge that gap between like what you're learning and then what you would actually use it for. And it's very hard when you don't have any experience to like bring it across the domain.
Yeah.
And so like what I did there was like, I actually took all examples. Like I went through my tickets and I was like, okay, which ones of these can be good examples? And it was like, that resonates, it's so important to me to have good examples.
I think that there's a really interesting, underlying lesson there, is that sometimes any platform that's using stock examples, right? They're clean, they're a little bit sterile, and there are really no bugs. You're just trying to learn the process. But I think that learning really takes place when there are anomalies in data, or when there's like hooks in the questions, right? In real world data, it's very rarely perfectly clean, but that's when you're running into the challenges is where you really ingrain the knowledge. And I think that that's even valuable at an early stage. There's some value in like very straightaway tutorials, how you're doing it, but sooner rather than later in that learning process, I think we should be upping the level of difficulty or making it real, because frankly, real problems are fun. Sterile problems, at least for me personally, I don't get as much enjoyment out of.
Yeah. I will also say that, like, I think you have to, like, for me, I have to be at a certain level of mastery to have these like, dummy data things, for them to be meaningful and for me to understand what's doing it. So like, I'll have to take, if I'm trying to learn something, I'll have to take that and actually come up with a real example that means something to me. Oh, okay, that now I understand what that's doing. And I can see how that, if I've had that issue, there's many other people that have had that issue as well. And sounds like you kind of had that as well. It's like connecting the things is what's hard. And so, especially as a beginner.
Yeah. Well, the connections are something that I really want to stress, is that, we talk about how subject area expertise is important for data science quite a bit. And I think it's also very important for learning. So if I'm working on a problem, let's say my first data set is in golf, and I see an output of my model that doesn't line up with my understanding of the world, that would be concerning to me. But if it was a problem that was completely unrelated to anything that I know, I would just overlook that, and I would probably miss out on an incredible learning lesson or debugging lesson. And to me, again, I guess I'm kind of beating it to death, but the working on projects that a little bit something about, there's that additional safety net or that additional feedback loop that in my mind can really reinforce that learning process as well.
Yeah, I think it's also like an element of just understanding when things look wrong. Like, you don't have that if you don't have the domain knowledge. And that's so important. Like, when you're coding something up, when you're doing an analysis, it's just that sanity check. Like, does this make sense? Super important.
Absolutely. And I think we stress on it, domain knowledge, a lot in data science. And I'd love to hear how that's played a role in your career as you've kind of towed the line between data analysis, data science, and software engineering.
So I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. Can you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. I think, I'd love to understand how domain knowledge has helped you on projects, or helped you progress through your career, helped you understand problems that other people, or not that other people might not have, but have helped you to do a better job in your work. You don't have to get into any specifics, but I think at a high level, that's something that, again, we understand where that comes from in like the data specific space, but on the software side, especially as it relates to the user, I think that there's a lot of interesting stories or interesting lessons that can be learned there.
So I would say maybe going back to the previous jobs, so specifically dealing with marketing data, I think you cannot expect to build a model or any kind of learning system of any meaning if you don't understand the underlying data. Like, something might seem weird to you, but maybe that's just an indicator, like, oh, there was a flash sale. Of course, people are going to click through the roof on something like that. But I would say that, like, in kind of the role where I am now, I'm not the subject area expert. So, and it's okay, because you have to be able to work with others that are, and that might not necessarily be the data people. And I think that's an extremely important thing, is being able to listen to when other people know more than you about something. I don't know if that answers your question.
that you nailed it. I think that for me, we're never going to be the subject area in everything, right? I think it's very valuable in the learning process. I think in work, if you're working on a project, it behooves you to better understand the individual project that you're on. But at the same time, there's tremendous value in outsourcing some of that subject area expertise to people that know it and understand the domain really well. And that's essentially what multidimensional teams are constructed for, is that, hey, we bring these people together with more specialized knowledge, and then we can create something that's greater than the sum of the parts. And we're talking about subject area across a specific domain. Let's say it's agriculture, but we can also talk about subject area across the the profession, whether it's software engineering, data science, or data analysis. And I would be interested, from your experience working in kind of both roles, What could data scientists or data analysts learn from software engineers and vice versa?
So I would say that data analysts and scientists could learn from software engineering mentality is like reusable code, breaking things down into tiny pieces, and definitely object-oriented programming. Just the ability to recognize that this is something that could be used for other things, and then to sit there and package it up. I feel like sometimes when we use notebooks, we get into this like, oh, we'll just copy the cells, move them around, or like then you have this like monstrosity there and it works. And next time you go to do it, then you have to remember what you had. Whereas, you take a step back and really think about like, okay, this part here, I've been doing this in like all of my analyses. Okay, so this is now like something that goes and collects the data, and I'll just pass it in a query or whatever. And then just thinking that way and breaking things down into little pieces, I think it's just such a great way of thinking. And as far as like when you do the analysis the next time, so fast, and then you can work on other things you had in mind, the bigger tasks that you need to tackle.
And does that start at the beginning of the project? Or so essentially how I do a lot of things is I'll have one of those Frankenstein notebooks where I have all the stuff, and then the next iteration I go through, I'll use a text editor. I won't use like an interactive notebook, and I'll go through and write better code, so it's slowly improving as it's moving more and more towards production. Is that, do you think that's an acceptable approach, or should we be starting thinking about how the end product of our data science work is going to look rather than necessarily versioning? I don't think one is right compared to the other, but what is the more like software engineering approach there?
Well, so I would say that there's an element of both. And this is also like what I would say that software engineers can learn from data scientists, is that it's okay to work in a notebook. I feel like there are some software engineers or people that just turn their nose up at working in notebooks, but it's such a great way of just experimenting quickly with something, fleshing out the details, and then, then you move on. But I feel like when you approach a problem, just in general, breaking it down into pieces, maybe it's the right time to break it down into individual pieces right there, or maybe it's just you're structuring your notebook in that way, and then you'll come back later and do it. I don't think there's a set rule on how it should be done, but I do think that like you have to be almost aware at a higher level what you're doing and like how it fits into the scope of things. And is this something that's going to reappear and maybe in another shape, but kind of in the same form, and being able to recognize those opportunities to like take things from other spots and combine them.
Nice. I think that, so I have one friend who he's a data scientist now, but he's working on his PhD in computer science, was a software engineer for a bunch of years, and he still writes all of his data science code in Vim. He does everything in Vim. I mean, it's absolutely incredible what he can do. I mean, knows all the shortcuts and all those things, but I'm like, dude, I think it might be easier if you used an IDE. But at the same time, he writes some of the most structured and clear systems that are reusable of any data scientist that I've ever seen. And so I love what you said about it's a little bit of a trade-off. It's a little bit of a soft scale, but I think that both software engineers and data scientists could probably move a little bit more towards the middle on that spectrum and benefit from it. Yeah,
that's exactly how I feel.
Awesome. Well, I really want to transition just a little bit more into, I guess, into the workflow related to software engineering. And so we had talked offline about your experience with design thinking and taking a course from IDEO. Obviously, from the course that I teach, which was co-taught with someone who is a alumni of IDEO, I have some interesting perspective on this as well. And I'd love to hear what you learned about human-centered design thinking, how that applies to your work, and how that might have changed your perspective about general software engineering work or whatever that might be.
So I would say, like, probably when anyone starts out in software engineering, you kind of have this mindset that what the thing should look like, and then maybe then you present it to the customer like, what's that? And they're like, there's a great video, like a meme video, where someone's like, oh, here's the software engineer watching someone test it, and they're just like, there's these things where you put different shapes into holes, And they're just, the tester is just putting all the shapes into the same hole. The person's like, no, you're breaking my code. But it's kind of like the same thing. Like you have in your mind, this is going to work this way. And then you actually give it to someone to use. And it's like, maybe they don't even understand what you have there. They're not seeing things the same way. And I feel like as you mature as a software engineer, you kind of get to that point where you realize just how much the front end and like the face of what you're working on, the design is so important. It's like, that's what people see at the end of the day. Like, it doesn't matter how nice your back end code is. If people don't understand what's in the front end, it's no one's gonna use it. And I think the course that we did was around capturing insights, so interviewing people, and that's just like the tip of the iceberg, but talking to the customers of the products and just trying to understand what is it that they really want without you influencing them in any way. And it's so subtle, but you can see how easy it is to do that when you ask these questions, and how just you have to be so careful what you say and what you ask. But you really need to listen, and what they're saying is sometimes just so different from what you thought or what you imagined. But it's just so important. I don't think that you can move forward in data or in software engineering without some aspect of that design, understanding that, right? Because it's not just building the UX, it's like your visualizations, your models. Do they make sense to the people that would be using it?
Yeah, I think it's really easy to lose sight as a data scientist or as a software engineer that everything that we're building is at some point for people. And if we're just building something because it's the most efficient, or we think that it makes the most sense from a technical perspective, that doesn't necessarily mean that it makes the most sense from a human perspective or a use case perspective. And I think that there are incredible ways to quantify human behavior and understand what people do, but there's also tremendous value in understanding why people do certain things, because even through interviews, you can get an idea of unarticulated needs. We can understand that someone is using our platform for XY use case, but it's an intermediary step for them to get to Z use case. And in a way, if we adjust our product, we could get them straight to Z and make them a lot happier. And you don't come to those conclusions. Well, you can come to those conclusions from data, but it's often a lot easier just studying behavior or asking people questions to be able to unearth what they really want versus how they're using their product to get what you think they want. And to me, there's just so much depth of people are so deep and complex that a lot of the times it's just easier to talk to them to be able to create a really good solution than to divine it from something else.
I'll also add on that and saying that sometimes people don't say anything, but they are having that problem or that issue using it, and they just won't say anything until you go ask them. And that's like a whole nother thing. It's like, you might think everything's fine, and it turns out you've been inflating the number by 7, and people are like, the data's wrong, we don't use it, but the underlying thing's correct. So yeah, we use it. Like, so it's just like, you have to talk to people. You cannot just use the data, I guess, in that sense. Like it has to be some level of interaction amongst people, especially the customers.
I would agree. I think that, from what I've been learning from Oveta, who I've had in a past interview, is that it isn't just the customers. Like, we should be creating feedback loops within software engineering teams, data science teams, with either designers or subject area experts more, because a lot of the times, I know I am very guilty of it, I make assumptions. And it's really important to challenge our assumptions as we go. And, whether it's storing data, whether it's what type of model we should be using, or the data we're using in a model, the assumptions around that, I think that those are points where some design perspective or asking questions or having, I hate to say this, more people involved in that process can be a good thing. I mean, we're so focused on efficiency, which I think is good. You want to optimize, but we lose out on potential value out of people through this process a lot of the time. And I think that design is one way to or like the overarching design framework is one way to inject that value back into the system. Whereas, we're constantly moving more and more towards pure productionization, auto ML, these types of things that I think for a lot of use cases, we might have to backtrack a little bit before we can move forward.
No, I really like what you said about other people like on the team. And I think in the team that I had, the previous job, we were a designer, myself, and then, more of a technical person. And so the perspective that I got, like when I would say maybe something that was more of data focused, and then hearing, what the designer thought of that and how that was like not as straightforward as I was thinking it was, it was eye-opening at times. Just to have that, like, that it's not so black and white, that what you put there might make sense to one set of people and not another. And, even if none of us were the customer, we still all had, combining those views definitely improved what we ended up then presenting to the customer of that product. And then I'll say that also, like in my current role, so that I'm straddling that data scientist, software engineering line, is that a lot of the things that I am building, I am sometimes my own customer, or like one of the customers. And so sometimes I build something and then, I switch my hat to the data scientist hat and I go to use it. And I'm like, oh, this is not a good way of doing this. And so, you iterate, but it's like back and forth. And then maybe it's like, maybe I develop something that's an analysis and then I want to then automate it. And so then I'm going the reverse way. And I'm like, oh my God, what was I doing here? Like this needs to be done better. And so it's interesting, even when it's yourself going back and forth, because just by having a different mindset, you see it entirely different, the problem and the solution too.
Well, you brought up a skill that I think is super overlooked, and that's being able to look at things from different perspectives. I loved your analogy of putting on a different hat and becoming a different person. And I think that that's something that very effective data scientists and data scientist managers are able to do really well, probably on the software engineering side as well. I can't speak as well to that, but being able to look at either, code from a different angle, or from the consumer perspective, or for a manager perspective, or from an individual data scientist, data analyst perspective, that allows you to understand like some flaws in your thinking, but it also allows you to, again, create the feedback loop that we've discussed. I think that, a lot of the time to develop that skill, though, you have to talk to a lot of people. You have to meet a lot of people. And frankly, within this domain, that isn't something that I think a lot of data scientists necessarily go out of their way to do, or software engineers go out of their way to do. Some do. I mean, that'd be a way too broad of a generalization to say no, that wasn't the case. But I think as a large portion compared to some other professions, business analysts, whatever it is, there is less of that interest in going out and seeking other perspectives. And so the question is, should we just encourage it? Should we enforce it in some way? And I don't think that there's necessarily a right answer to that, but it is just interesting to think about it as at a high level.
I will say that that's something I've also struggled with. And I think it's almost something that just comes with maturity. And as you progress in your career, you kind of, like I was mentioning before, like, you're initially building things, you kind of only think about building it how you want it and how you think people are going to use it, and you're right. And then you kind of like mature over that, and you realize, you need to take from other people, you need to incorporate what other people are saying, you need to talk to people. And also even the sense of like, me coming from just building things to now working information security. And now it's like, I spent a good part of my initial few months just learning the security side of things. And now it's like, you kind of like switch your hat again, and then you're looking back at all the code you wrote and you're like, well, that was not too secure. Like, oh, how would I attack what I built before? And so I feel like there's just so much information, so many things that you should be doing that you can't possibly do them all. And so I think, it should be encouraged, but some people just aren't comfortable with that until they feel confident enough in their own skills too. So I don't have a good answer for that.
Well, I don't expect everyone to have like a quarter life crisis and start a podcast to start talking to people. So, there you go. Well, you talked about a lot of the learning you were doing just then about security, and I'm interested. You're also pursuing your master's in computer science while also working full time and just having finished a
Yes.
book. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Hi, I'm
Wow.
Stephanie, and I have a problem.
So I'd love to hear about maybe some of the reasons why you decided to pursue that. I'd also be interested if you can talk about it, if that is something that work is helping pay for, or doing something along those lines. That's something that um, I think is a really important conversation to have. I funded my own master's degree in computer science, and I wouldn't say I regret it, but I say I've accumulated quite a bit of debt associated with it. And so maybe just a little overview of that, first with why you decided to go back, and then second, a little bit about maybe some of the economics associated with that.
Sure. So I would say that as I became more and more aware that I was interested in the computer science, I kind of had those moments where I was like, oh, I wonder, what would have been different in my life if I had studied that in college. And that was like the initial thought. And I was like, oh, I want to go back and get a computer science degree, because then to me, it kind of like solidifies that knowledge, and it gives me that I don't know what the word for it, but it's like proving it to myself that I have those skills and I have the credentials. And then as I continued to progress, it almost got to the point where it kind of morphed a little bit, and that I didn't think what would have happened if I took a different degree. I was like, no, I think what the degree I had was right, and that it's more now that this is just like rounding out the rough edges. And so I feel like I've been getting a ton of value out of it. It's actually super cost effective. My employer is helping pay for it, but even if they didn't, it would be like, drop in the bucket. It's Georgia Tech, and they're actually like written about. It's very, very cost effective. So,
well, one of my friends did their data analytics program pretty recently and just graduated, and I've heard very good things about it.
Yeah. So I would say there hasn't been a course that I didn't like say, wow, I've actually learned a lot in here, or like even if it was something that I wasn't maybe like, oh, I want to take this one, and maybe it was a requirement, but I was like, I did get a lot out of that. It's sometimes there's a lot of work, not gonna lie, but so I'm on my 6th course now, and I have to take 10, but I think it's been immensely valuable, and it just working on those assignments, and then also working on stuff at work, and it's almost like doing all that extra coding. It's like I'm making up for lost time that maybe I didn't have previously. So I noticed a couple semesters ago. So I take one course a semester, and I had a moment where I was just like, wow, my debugging capabilities, or just my ability to like spew out code, has just grown tremendously, because I'm working on all these different projects and different use cases at once, and I definitely feel like I'm growing a lot in that aspect, and I'm also gaining knowledge about different fields that I maybe never would have looked into before. So that's I'm really incredible.
And one thing I would ask is, like, do you see this as something that's like the focus of going back is helping your career, or that you're going back and it's a learning endeavor more so than a career endeavor? Because I think that's a very important distinction. I don't want to corrupt your answer, but I generally think that if you're looking to do a master's degree just as a career stepping stone, I don't think that's necessarily the best reason to do it, because you've clearly gotten to a very good place in the data field and in the software engineering field without having one to begin with.
Yeah, no, this was entirely for me. This was something that I wanted, and knowing myself and knowing how busy I get myself at times, that I just knew that if I wanted to be like, marking off all these MOOCs that I would take that maybe had the exact same material, is I know that I would just not do it. Something else would come up. I'd decide to do some other thing. And so it's almost like having enrolling and having, money, betting on it almost. It's like, it pushes pushes me to keep going and to do it. But it's for myself.
Well, I think that's important, that you know yourself well enough to know that if you didn't make that additional commitment, you wouldn't do it. I am very much the same way. Admittedly, when I went back and I did mine, it was a little bit before there was quite as much prevalence in MOOCs and online courses. And so I felt like that was one of the best options. There were still boot camps and stuff, but I thought that, hey, if I went really deep into computer science, I already have a math background. There would be, well, not like a pure math back, but like business and statistics-ish background. There would be enough of, like I could really jump into it and make computer science what I wanted. I won't lie. I just talked about how it shouldn't be your main focus to use as a job stepping stone. But I also think that when you're doing a degree like this, you should have a very clear and compelling story associated with it. And mine was that if I went and did computer science rather than data science per se, one, I have more flexibility in terms of roles after. I could go into software engineering, not just data science, but I would also be able to let other people know, employers know, whatever it might be, that I have more expertise in the computer science field. And there is like strong signaling associated with that, even within the data science domain. I was always looking at business and technology and data like coming together, and I was like, well, I might as well just go deep into all of those things independently rather than together, because I think that there is something, I don't know, there's like some weird stigma or some like dissent around learning those as one combined thing. I feel like you might, I don't actually believe that you might, but I think people think that you might lose something by learning data science as a whole rather than the pieces a little bit around the perimeter, which, as I say it now, it seems a little bit silly, but who knows?
Well, so I actually wasn't sure if I wanted to do like a data science degree or a computer science degree. And it was kind of how I was mentioning before, like I had to take a step back and evaluate like what do I enjoy the most? And then just looking at the curriculums, I really liked the computer science aspect, that it was computer science, but specifically focused on machine learning, focused on the data science part. And that was essentially the way to combine both of those things. I didn't want to just be drowning in math without coding. And so it was super important for me to combine it from that angle.
This episode is brought to you by Z by HP, HP's high compute, workstation grade line of products and solutions. As datasets get larger, unraveling meaningful insights can become more time consuming and costly. Z is specifically made for high performance data science solutions, and I personally use the ZBook Studio and the Z4 workstation. I really love that Z workstations can come standard with Linux, and they can be configured with the data science software stack. With the software stack, you can get right to the work of doing data science on day one without the overhead of completely reconfiguring your new machine. These powerful machines are being used to solve real-world problems as well. If you're a student and you want to get your hands on one of these, there's a great opportunity right this second. HP is hosting a Kaggle competition to identify and localize COVID-19 anomalies, and the student team that scores the highest will receive a top-of-the-line ZBook Studio. Now, back to our episode. Incredible. And so, okay, before we talk about the book, because I want to talk a lot about that, you did bring up that you have a problem perhaps with balance or putting a lot on your plate. And I'd like to dive into that a little bit more and get your perspective on essentially staying busy. I mean, it seems like you're doing quite a bit. I think you might even be more busy than me, which is pretty impressive.
I'm not sure.
I'd like to understand your philosophy around that, and perhaps not to get too deep into your psyche, but why that is, or what's, if that's a good thing or a bad thing, or it's just something that's net neutral.
Yeah, honestly, I can't pinpoint when this started, but I've always liked being busy, and like even in a work sense, like when I finish something, I'm always looking, well, what can I do next? What makes sense to do next? And I think it's important to think like that, but it can definitely get you into trouble and have you like absorb things that maybe could be left for other people or could be left for later. And I also have a problem saying no to things that are good opportunities, So like someone asks, oh, do you want to present at this conference? Sure, of course I do. And so I get myself into these situations, and then maybe there's coming at all different angles, right? So maybe it's presenting, and then it's, finishing up the book, and it's, we have an exam coming up for the course, and then it's work stuff. So I won't pretend to have the solution for balance. I don't think I do it well. I think there are times where things are balanced, and then something comes along and shifts the balance, and it's a rough couple of weeks, months. until things get righted again. But I will say to me, it's been so important to have like a support network when I get into those situations. Especially, in the work sense, I have a really great relationship with my manager, and he often brings up the word balance when we talk for these reasons. But I don't think that, without having such an open line of communication and being able to be like honest about things and just work together on, maybe there's too many work deadlines all stacked up together, just feeling comfortable to be able to say like, hey, I need a breather, let's move these around, like, can we reprioritize? That has been such an important thing for me to get more comfortable with and start learning. And also just like pushing back, being better at pushing back on things. As I am probably very driven by deadlines, and I like knowing when things have to be done, and then I can, rearrange when I need to do everything so that I can make the deadlines and everything, and then, everything gets done, but it's very difficult. And then maybe I'm not pushing back on everything I can push back on. Sometimes I make a decision, maybe like, oh, that one, I don't know if I can push back on that. And then, a week after the deadline, I'll get an email reminding people to do the thing. I'm like, you see, I could have pushed back on that one, but I didn't. I rushed to get it done, and now look at me. So, yeah, I mean, I struggle with it. I'd love to hear how you approach it.
I also struggle with it. I think that something that I found is, I forgot who said it, but there's no static states in nature, right? The idea of balance in terms of like, like two plates on like a scale or something like that is like, it's truly not in balance if we look at things in the entire scheme of everything, right? Because there's wind, there's whatever, there's the earth is turning, there's just so much going on. And the idea that we can find something like that in our lives, I think is overblown. I think that like balance cannot come in the short term. Like there's like days we're going to have a lot of stuff. There's days where we're going to have nothing. And just trying to create a balancing act over the long term, 6 months, a year, where you're giving yourself enough time to recharge is really important. I also think of things not as balancing tasks, but balancing different types of activities, some that give me energy and some that detract from my energy. So, for example, doing data science, coding, that depletes an energy tank of mine. I guess it's like cognitive focus. But if I'm doing something creative, if I'm making videos, if I'm talking to people, doing podcasts, that doesn't impede on my coding energy tank. And so I feel like I can do a lot of both of those things in a day and not feel completely worn out. But if I exhaust a bunch of the same energy tank in a day, I'm completely cooked. And finding these complementary activities or being involved in a bunch of different things for me has been sustainable because they don't exercise the same muscles. It's more of a difference across these things. I think that if I were to try to do a lot of similar things, if I do, for example, I do a couple podcast interviews and I speak in a conference, and it's just maybe 2.5 hours of total time, I'm done for like 2-3 days. I like my focus is shot, all this is done. But if it's like, hey, I did a podcast episode every day for the last, week and a half, and I coded a lot and did all these things, it doesn't feel like work to me. It just feels like they were all pushing off of each other to drive me forward. So I think choosing the activities that you do is really important. I'm also a big time scheduler, list user, whatever that might be. I have this Notion template that I use to run my entire life. That's like a database structure, and everything that I'm working on, I put it as in progress, and I like estimate how much time each of my individual tasks will take. And to me, that helps me just see everything that I have to do, because I think when you're doing something, it's not difficult usually, right? You're immersed in the work. But when you're thinking about all the stuff that you have to do, that is what makes it very difficult and stressful. And so just having a place where I know I didn't forget anything, where all of my stuff lives, and I can kind of export that out of my brain has been something that's allowed me to achieve quite a bit more. I also will say that people think I work a lot more than I do. I think that there's tremendous value in working in times when you feel energized. And like I work a lot of weekends, but I also will take off like a Thursday to go play golf. And that's, maybe one of the benefits of my schedule and the career path and the company that I work for. But at the same time, I think that part of that might show in your relationship with your boss, right? Is that you can ask for, you build respect, mutual respect, you build trust. And if you need extra time, you can fill that in some way. And there's that give and take because they know you're going to rebound in a certain way, in a positive way. So I think that a lot of any advice that I would have, and I'm obviously not an expert in this as well, would be to try to understand yourself and what your limits are, just like you'd mentioned, but also to adjust your lifestyle and adjust your working style and adjust your workflows so that it matches your energy levels and your capabilities. Again, if I was, if I was doing data science and I was doing a data science project, like for my work, and I was doing data science projects every week for YouTube, I don't think I would have a YouTube channel. Even though I would really like to do that. I think that would make incredible content. I just don't have the capacity to put that out there. And I know that that's a limitation of mine, and I'm okay with it.
No, I mean, actually that was really insightful for me, because I think, as you were saying, how you have these two different energy tanks. Well, I was thinking, I'm like, yeah, all the stuff on mine has been in the one tank. And so that's the reason why I get to this point where it's just because it's so overwhelming at times. It's just everything's all in there and draining the same tank. I'll need to find out some other things to do. One thing I've been trying to be very good about it is like cooking every night. And so that's my me time. And then, taking a long walk during lunch. Those are like my me times, my time to just reset. And I find that, having a walk in the middle of the day is kind of like resetting on the day. So be in the middle, reset. And then just trying to have a better, I guess, barrier at the end of the day. Like now we stop and it's cook dinner time, and get away.
Well, I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head. What I didn't touch on, I talked about how I have the different tanks, but taking this analogy a step further, there's different ways to refill those tanks, right? If I find that meditation, going out in nature, exercise, having me time when you're cooking or you're doing something that is, for me, the task-oriented things that are physical are incredible for recharging my mental reserves. And finding out what does that for you is really important. I read this book a while ago called Why We Sleep. And it's really important. It talks about it talks about how important sleep is. And I've been taking naps in the middle of the afternoon, which isn't exactly possible for everyone, but a 30-minute, hour-long nap. And I've realized that it hasn't affected my sleep after the fact, like in the evening. But I come out of that, I'm groggy for 30 minutes, but then I get this kind of, it's like I woke up at the beginning of the day again. And I do my best work in the 2 hours after I wake up. So I'm like, well, if I have 2 more hours where I'm doing my best work, or maybe even if it's just an hour, that's an incredible feeling for me to have. And, it's the same concept of what you've just described. But I also read this, I think it was kind of hokey science, but someone did a study on like geniuses and like prodigies compared to people that are putting in similar levels of work to achieve the same goal. So like a violinist who's excellent, but is working as hard as a prodigy who's just better. And one of the big differences that they saw was the number of naps that the prodigy took compared to. And so again, kind of hokey science. I'm not going to put it out there as truth, but it was interesting enough for me to experiment with. So if I start making genius level YouTube videos and podcasts, you know what happened.
Oh, naps during the day. That sounds nice. But I would say like I kind of get that similar feeling after I worked out.
Exactly.
In a past job, actually, that we had a weekly. It was every day of the week there was something right at lunchtime, and it was 4 of the days it was either yoga or Pilates. And I found that right after that, I was so productive. It was like the blood was flowing again instead of just being sitting and doing whatever. I was just like revitalized. And that's why I have to keep that part for me, because I do so much better if I'm working the whole day. It's just, you just start getting like dragging towards the end.
Yeah, well, I mean, yoga is also a very spiritual form of exercise, and there's mantras, and there's I did a yoga challenge for I think like 30 days recently, and I love those types of things because it's another way to just like take stock, but using, it's like meditation but physical, which I think is fascinating. I'm a big believer in all of that stuff, and yeah, I mean our mind over time, it does need time to recharge or completely detach. If you think about humans over the course of the last 10,000 years, we didn't have cell phones until the last like 20, right? And frankly, we had a lot of downtime before that. We would just, as cave people, we would just sit there, right? I mean, when it gets dark, what can you do? You just sit there. And our brains, I believe, are designed to have downtime, to have time where we're not actively engaging with something. And that's far and far the exception of the norm when we have Instagram that I had to delete it from my phone when I scroll through and I can't stop looking. And that was my 30-minute break, and I go right back into work. My brain was fully engaged. It didn't feel like it. It felt like I was kind of resting, but the truth to your brain is that you're going through all this intense emotion and you're engrossed in this thing. And so I highly encourage anyways to actually detach and kind of get into your own head a bit. I guess I'll get off of my soapbox because that's something I clearly care fairly deeply about.
Yeah, no, I would say it's one of those things for me. It's like I know what I'm doing is not going to help me, but then I just do it anyway. Like oh, I need to work on that assignment for school. It's late. I should probably not do this so I can sleep. But then there I am coding away, working on it. And I had an example like a couple nights ago. I was working on an assignment and I was like, wow, my numbers are really off on this one. I didn't know why. And then I went and watched TV, tried to relax, and I was thinking about it the entire time. And I was like, all right, fine, I'm gonna go watch the video, because I didn't watch the instructional video because I was like, oh, this is like Pandas stuff. I know how to do it. So I got the implementation right, but there was like one edge case that was like in the file that I didn't know about. And so I watched the video and I'm like, wait, I'm handling everything right. What is wrong with this? And then I was like, okay, do I go to sleep now or do I look at this? And I'm like, oh, I look at this. So I went and looked at it. But it was a happy ending, because I actually found what was wrong in like 10 seconds. As I happened to, it was super random, right? Because I just looked at the output and I'm like, that's a strange number that they would put there. And only because it was a strange number did I notice what was actually happening. But that would have been like another 3 hours awake in the middle of the night just looking at stuff.
Gotta get rid of those outliers.
And the thing is like I knew I shouldn't have even started the assignment because I knew that was going to happen. But then I was like, oh no, it'll be fine. I'll do it. Did it anyway. So
what happens? I mean, the important thing though is that you can observe that behavior and decide in the future if you would want to change that behavior. I mean, that to me, that's I probably wouldn't have slept well if I didn't finish it.
Exactly.
And so it's a nice feeling to have that you've completed something right before bed. On the flip side, I can also sleep in for the most part as late as I want. So
so for me, it was more like even before, like, so when I cooked, I had dinner, and then I was like, okay, should I start this or should I just take a day off? And I'm like, I'm going to start this. And that was the point of trouble. So it's not even like going back on, because I know I wouldn't have slept anyway. So it was better spent trying to fix it, because I was just going to lie awake anyways. But the actual act of like sitting there and deciding, do I want to start something when I should only have an hour to do this? Probably wasn't the best decision, but.
Well, again, at least you had a choice.
Yeah. But it was almost like it was going back to deadlines. Like I know I have something coming up in a couple of weeks that's going to make it harder to work on that. So I was like, oh, I'll start now. Didn't think I'd get so far. And then because I got so far, I'm like, oh, I have to finish. That's another problem I have, actually, which gets me into trouble. It's that when you feel like you're so close to the end that you just have to finish and push it over. And then it turns out that you weren't actually that close. And
Well,
it's like 3
maybe
hours later.
I think a paradigm shift might help there is that when you walk away from problems, even if you feel like you're close to finishing or if you feel like you're completely stuck, you, when we take naps or when we go for walks or when we do a lot of these things, that's white space for your brain to process those things, even if you're not directly thinking about them. And so a lot of the time, you legitimately save time and you do better work when you do step away because you're letting the unconscious parts of your brain or the essentially like the even smarter parts of your brain function at their highest level for when you come back. So maybe that's just like a I mean, like I think we all intuitively know that if we walk away from something when we come back, seeing it with different eyes
Yeah.
very, very
Oh,
frequently
yeah.
improves things. But just, I guess, ingraining that message can also be pretty compelling.
I think it's also difficult in the sense like sometimes you feel like you have like a whole list of things in your head that you want to try before you give up and then decide to walk away. And so I'm trying now, and I've been doing this for a while now. Is like when I'm like, okay, it's time to go for my walk. I kind of just do a brain dump, and I just do like the to-dos all in the code, and I'm like, oh, this is gonna happen here, this is gonna happen here. And so if I don't write it down, like I was saying to you earlier, I forget it. So at least having it there, it's almost like my brain can let it go, and then I can be okay and sleep. Like I can sleep. If I wake up in the night, I'm like, oh, there's an idea. I just write it down on the pad next to the bed, and then I can turn over and go to sleep instantly. It's just like it's been released, it's been captured, and I'm good now. But if I don't write it down, I'm lying there the whole night thinking about it. And if I tell myself, oh, you'll remember, no, I won't. Write it down. I'm gonna go to sleep.
I'm the exact same way. I highly recommend Notion. I've been using it for like essentially like 5 or 6 months, and it's incredible.
Does it support to-do lists within to-do lists? Because I've been known to do that.
It does,
Oh,
in fact,
okay.
support
I'll
to-do
have to
lists.
do this.
That's the beauty is it's like unbelievably flexible. So we have about 10 minutes left here, and I wanted to make sure we touch on your book and the experience of going through that. So the first thing I'd like to understand is how you tackled such a big project like that. We've talked about how you like to take on a lot, but to me, this is a bit of a different category because you have to structure everything and then you actually have to do the work. And I'd love to know your process of getting through that.
So I would say it's kind of like that software engineering mentality of breaking things down into smaller pieces. So, the book is like, okay, the book has to have the topic of data analysis and pandas. And then, what goes into there, breaking that down into major categories that are say chapters or sections. And then in the sections are chapters. And then having a very general outline of what each one was. And then from there, breaking that down again. So it's like going from the out, it's almost like, you're opening the boxes and there's another box inside, another box inside. Keep doing that. And I think by the time I actually came to writing it, I had the outline for each chapter and then like just like a sentence or two about what each of the core concepts of the chapter would be. And I went to write the first chapter like that, and I was just like, this does not work. So like I really need to like have even more detail than that. So then I had to take a step back and go through each of those sections and then break it down even further. And so it was like things had to be divided up like into small pieces that were manageable. So like I would know, oh, I'm going to write about this particular, or the group by, say, like in pandas, and that's going to be this section. And then, okay, what examples would go in there? And then I would be able to write it. So I had to have like a super detailed outline, kind of like a to-do list. And then I could assign the dates to there because I like my deadlines. So I would have, how could I divide up each of those sections that I had designated, like this piece on that chapter or these examples, and then, work back from my due date, across all the things and align, oh, this will take 3 days, this will take 5 days, and then setting them up along the schedule. And then only at that point could I stare at the screen, see the cursor on the blank screen and actually put something on the page. And I'll tell you, just the experience of doing the second edition versus the first edition, it's just like unbelievable how much harder from the blank page it is. It's just, you can stare at that, and writer's block is true even in this kind of a book. So you just stare at it and you're like, oh my God, I don't know where to start. That's the hardest part. Like once you have at least something there, it becomes a little easier. But like that first bit, like going from that initial outline to those first few sentences, that was the hardest part. Always.
So how much time would you say you dedicated to the planning and the outlining compared to the actual writing itself?
So I would say, because I didn't know I was going to need to do such detailed outlines, that I kind of had to do it on the fly. And so I had already had the dates agreed to, and I had to work with it. Like, okay, well, how can I fit things in and get things done in time? And so it was like, all right, it's time to start writing chapter 1. Okay, let me set aside a couple hours, maybe a day, and just think about what goes in here first. So like I had like a whole day sometimes that was just the planning for the outline. And then from there, with the dates in mind, with the examples that I was thinking of, then I could actually go and then write. So I had to set aside some of the time that would have been valuable writing time to plan for all that stuff.
Incredible. So one kind of last portion of the book, there are 2 other things associated with the book that I find pretty fascinating. So the first, we've touched on the hands-on element in the first part of this interview. And I'd love to understand where you got a lot of the use cases from, a lot of the data sets from, that make it so that it is hands-on, that it is real data. And then I'd like to talk about your ability to take critical feedback that you worked on throughout the course of the book with your boss and with some other people that you work with. Those are unbelievably fascinating to me, and I think that that's an important part of becoming a better data scientist, a better communicator, a better author.
Yeah. So as I was mentioning before, one of the things that was like a driving force for me in the book is to have those real examples so that people could connect, people could see examples where data isn't perfectly cleaned for you, or when building a model doesn't have a great result. Things don't always work out, actually in the field. And that was very important for me to instill in there. And I kind of just, searched for data sets that I could use that seemed to have some things that weren't quite like what you would expect for them, or that made something a little bit more difficult than it could have been if it was perfectly prepared and handed to you. And I let my curiosity drive me to find those. So I remember actually, so prior to deciding I wanted to do the master's degree, I realized I was very interested in coding and wanted to explore that avenue a little bit more. And I ended up getting this scholarship with Udacity to do Android development. And so I had some job experience from college, so it was not a big deal. And in building those apps, one of the apps that we built was, it was like an earthquake tracker or something, where you could see, how many earthquakes just happened and what their magnitudes were. And so like I knew what the API was, and I was like, oh, that would be a great example of like working with an API and pulling data out and figuring out how to collect it in the first place. And so there were certain things that I had exposure to from other avenues, and I figured it'd be nice to connect. And I think, especially I would say in previous jobs, APIs for someone, when I had very little coding experience at the time, felt like these mystical things. I was like, how do you connect these? How do you do that? And it just seemed complicated, but it's very simple. And I think there was almost the point where, the immaturity of like feeling like you need to know how everything works in order to use something built on top. Whereas getting to the point where you're like, I can use what's on top. I know in general what goes on underneath, and that's all. So like being comfortable with that. So I wanted to include things that like I would have wanted to know when I was starting out. So awesome. Just seeing how easy it is to collect data from an API and how you can get stuff from government websites. So
that's incredible. In theory, I guess we shouldn't know what's going on behind the scenes of most APIs, right? That's like that's part of the beauty of them as well.
I mean more in the sense of like say you're going to use the request library in Python. Like knowing exactly how each of the things is done, or like, trying to do it all in curl or something. Like you can do it, it's fine. But like, starting out that way, that was not the best. Like I was drowning myself in the details when I should have just been like, no, you just do this and now you have the data, and then go back and like figure out what's going on. Like it was, I think, especially like when you're newer, you kind of get to the point where like you see all the stuff that you have to know, and it's just so overwhelming. And then you just try to like scatter yourself across all these things and try to learn all these things when you would a lot of times be better off, focusing on a few areas, getting a little bit under your belt, and then you can go to the other sections.
I agree. That's one thing that I used to do. So documentation, I'd pull it up, I'd go through every method, I'd go through all this stuff. And then now I'll open up documentation, I'll just like copy and paste the example code, and then I'll either use that or I'll just like experiment with it a little bit. And then I probably should go back and review the documentation for what all the methods and stuff do. But at the same time, it's like, why are we using this? If it's for something that I've used before, like even like scikit-learn, I'll go back, I'll just like, too lazy to remember it, I'll go in, I'll just go to the documentation page, I'll copy it in, I've used it 100 times before. Is there really a need to go in through like the minute detail, depending on the use case? But for most things, probably not. So the last thing I really did want to touch on is the idea of accountability and feedback and how to give constructive feedback or take constructive feedback. We talked offline about how the people you work with have been incredible at giving you good feedback, and how perhaps at the start that was a little bit difficult. I know for me it's difficult to take constructive feedback. So I'd love to hear about that journey for you and what you learned about feedback, but also about yourself.
So I would say going into it, I knew that I was going to get feedback from a friend she's the reviewer, but I also wanted to have additional feedback, because obviously the more feedback you get, the better the end product. But so I started actually writing the book within a few months of starting my current role. And so, it kind of takes a little bit of time to get to the point where you feel comfortable, like almost spilling your guts to someone, right? Because like that, your writing is it can be very personal. It's like your style, your way of doing things. And there was a while where I didn't want people I worked with to read it. But then, I had this moment where I was like, when this is published, there's no way I can stop people from reading it, right? So I might as well get comfortable with people who I know reading what I wrote, and like, they're going to tell me how they feel anyway. So why not just get that done now and make it even better so that when other people see it. And so it was very hard to get over that initial, like, thinking about what they're going to be criticizing and what they're going to say in there and when their feedback. But I realized that it was for the good of the book, for the good of even, my image after this comes out, that I just had to be willing to put myself through that process, even though it's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel great having your work ripped apart, but in the end, it makes a much better product. And I will say that the first chapter in the first edition, I struggled so much writing it the first time. And again, because it was like that point where it's like the first chapter is very difficult in general, because you have to kind of engage people, you have to kind of give background information. It sets the tone for the whole book. But there's a lot of stuff that has to be covered. And so it was very difficult to like approach, how do I write this? What's my voice, right? And then when I did have it, and I spent so much time on this, and that's the first one, we go over, and it's like, I remember my boss, like he had like a red pen, like the whole thing it was like bleeding basically. And it was like, wow, okay, that bad. and it's not like it was like, the whole thing was bad. It was like, there's certain things, this could be said better, and it was all stuff that they were all valid points. It's not going to say it doesn't hurt, like it doesn't, wow, okay. But you have to learn to, like, I guess, and I'm not going to say I'm an expert in this either, is that you have to learn that it's not criticizing you, right? It's not something you should be taking personally. It's what's there, and it's being done so you can improve it, not to like knock you down. And that was one of the last chapters that I went back and rewrote, because I was like, wow, there's so much to do here. While we were going through the rewrites, while we were going through the reviews, I was still writing other chapters. And so you could see how when we had started reviewing these, maybe I was like, 5 or 6 chapters in, and then like there's like a change in the style, like from what I was giving them to review, because I had been incorporating things along the way and like changing, and so it was like those were much better the last few chapters. So when I went back to do the final drafts, that was a lot easier to update things. But we had these sessions where I would meet with the reviewers, and they would have their marked up copies. And it was like, all right, let's have at it. Tell me what's on there. And it would be like, one comment at a time. And I'm like, okay. And I'm just like writing my notes to myself. And I rewrote maybe 75% of that first chapter from all of that. So it was like going through the whole thing again. It was so many things had to be changed. But I think it has definitely been. It was a great experience in the sense that you definitely get more comfortable with the feedback. I don't think you ever get completely comfortable hearing that. It's never nice, but you definitely learn to see it in a different light. Like this is being done to help me and not to say something bad about me, right? And after I finished the things and I read it, and even when I went back and read, so I read through the whole book when I was preparing for the second edition. And when I was reading through, I was like, this reads very nice. I'm very happy with this. That was the first time I read through the whole thing, like on the physical copy. I have a rule. Exactly. But I have a rule. I do not look at them because I don't want to know what typos are in there that I missed. So I will not open the second edition until if there's a third edition. So then I'll open it. So
interesting. Well,
yeah.
So I like that you kind of seeked feedback in your own right. I mean, something in some sense. I think that for me, for content, for YouTube videos, there's just a lot of unwanted feedback. And honestly, there's a lot of just like mean feedback, but there's a lot of feedback that you're like, this is mean, but it's also constructive. And in some sense, you didn't have to sift through like, is this person attacking me, or is there something constructive to say? I'm constantly trying to figure out how to get more feedback on the things that I produce. And it's hard to find people that you trust or that are willing to put in that time for you. And so I think that is something for anyone who's trying to get better. It doesn't necessarily have to be a mentor. It doesn't necessarily have to be your boss, but finding people who are in your community or in your circle to be able to be somewhat vulnerable with them with your work, and them not taking advantage of that or them not being mean about it is a really special thing to have. So my thought is that I would encourage people to, take an audit of their lives and say, who are these people in my circle or that I'm friendly with that could help me with these types of things? And if I don't have people available to me like that, how do I go out and find them? And I think finding them is a journey that I still haven't figured out. I mean, I have some content friends that I do those types of things with, but they're fairly few and far between. And that is something that I think can help you to take incredible leaps in the quality of your learning, the quality of your content, the quality of even your character. It's just a matter of being willing to put in the time and being willing to open yourself up like that.
I really liked how you described it as like being vulnerable. And that's definitely what it felt like. It's like you're lowering your guard and you're like, take your best shot. But
just don't knock me out.
Yeah. So it was interesting because one of the people who was one of the reviewers, she offered to do it. She's like, oh, I'll review it. And then later on, I found out that she's like, I didn't think you'd make it past the 5th chapter. So I was like, oh, okay, nice. I'm like, you see? And I'm like, no, you didn't see, because you didn't know me, because we had only met a couple months prior to that. So you didn't know me. That's what, if you had known me, maybe you wouldn't have decided to do this. It's a lot of work.
Well, that's really all the questions that I had. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I think everyone is going to get quite a kick out of it and hopefully learn quite a bit about it. Before I leave the floor to you to say any closing remarks, I do want to remind everyone that Stefanie here is giving away, I believe it is 10 of these hands-on data analysis with Pandas books for people who comment. So we'll randomly select 10 people from the comment section here and get these books delivered to you. So
nice comments.
Definitely, yeah, exactly. Definitely engage with this video. I'd love to hear if you want something specific to talk about, maybe talking about what we had just discussed here, how you're going and pursuing finding people that'll give you honest feedback with your work. Incredible. All right, so the floor is yours. If you have any closing remarks, if you have any causes you wanna stand, if you have anything that you'd particularly like to part with.
Nothing comes off the top of my head.
No problem. It's a lot of pressure, honestly. I've realized
Yeah.
that it's kind of fun. That's my last jab at the guests, is that like put you on the spot. I just
I guess
don't.
one thing I could say is just ask questions.
There you go.
Ask questions. I see that as something like when you are earlier on in your career, I feel like you're a lot more hesitant to ask questions and to speak up, and you feel almost, well, this is from my personal experience, is that you feel like maybe, people are going to see that you don't know as much as, they think you know, or like there's some imposter syndrome thing there. And you kind of don't ask questions, and you could learn a lot more if, again, going back to the vulnerable thing, if you're asking questions and you admit you don't know things, and you seek out people that can teach you. So it's not just seeking out people that will give you feedback, but also people that can just answer your questions and not judge you. And people that you feel comfortable doing that with, I think is very important.
I would agree. I mean, the worst thing that I've never had someone just like berate me for asking a dumb question, right? It's always like, maybe they won't answer if you ask it on a digital medium. And usually, almost always, that's the worst that'll happen, is you don't get an answer. And so you ask someone else, and it's okay. So I think that there's something very beautiful in asking questions. And that's something that makes anyone successful in, especially this domain, is asking questions of people as well as data, as we've discussed pretty thoroughly in the interview. So again, Stefanie, thank you so much for coming in. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I'm looking to see more about what happens with the second edition of the book.